This man could have made $7 billion. Instead, one simple question changed everything. The people, I would say, there is no patent. Could you patent the sun? Those 12 words turned Jonas Salk into one of the most famous men in America. But the story most people know isn't the whole story. To understand why those words still matter today, you first have to return to a time when parents feared something far more terrifying than war: polio. Every summer, from the 1930s through the early 1950s, America waited. Not for a storm, not for an invasion, for a virus: polio. No one knew which child would be next. Most infections caused only mild symptoms, sometimes none at all. But sometimes the virus reached the nervous system, destroying the cells that controlled movement. A healthy child could go to bed with a fever and wake up unable to walk. In the worst cases, the muscles needed to breathe simply stopped working. Hospitals filled with iron lungs, towering steel machines keeping children alive, one mechanical breath at a time. Some children spent weeks inside, others spent years. One of them was Paul Alexander. He caught polio when he was only 6 years old. He would spend most of the rest of his life inside an iron lung. While the world slowly forgot, Paul never could. Then came 1952. More than 21,000 Americans were left paralyzed. The worst outbreak in the nation's history. There was no cure, no vaccine, only fear. Only a few days later, Jonas Salk was born in New York City, 1914. His parents were Russian Jewish immigrants. They believed education could change a family's future. Salk became a physician, but treating patients was never his ultimate goal. He wanted to stop diseases before they reached anyone at all. By the late 1940s, he was leading a research team at the University of Pittsburgh. Their mission was simple to describe, almost impossible to achieve: create a vaccine against polio. At the time, most scientists believed there was only one answer: a live, weakened virus. Jonas Salk disagreed. He believed a virus didn't have to be alive to teach the immune system. If he could kill the virus without destroying its identity, the body might still learn how to fight it. Many experts dismissed the idea. Some believed it could never work. Others thought he was wasting his time. Salk kept going, day after day, experiment after experiment. His team successfully grew all 3 known strains of poliovirus. Then they treated them with formaldehyde. The virus was dead. It could no longer reproduce. But Salk hoped the immune system would still recognize it. It was a bold idea. Now he had to prove it was right. Before asking the public to trust his vaccine, he made an extraordinary decision. He tested it on himself, then on his wife, then on his own 3 sons. It was an extraordinary act of confidence. But confidence wasn't enough. A few successful injections inside one laboratory could never convince an entire nation. The next step would become the largest medical experiment the world had ever seen. By 1954, Salk's vaccine had survived every laboratory test. Now it faced its greatest challenge: the real world. Nearly 2 million American children took part in what would become the largest medical field trial in history. Some received the vaccine, others received a placebo. Some were simply observed. Neither the children nor most of the adults around them knew who had received which. They became known as the Polio Pioneers. Across America, parents signed consent forms, not with certainty, with hope and fear. They weren't simply joining a medical study. They were trusting science with the lives of their children. Then they waited. Weeks turned into months. Researchers collected data. Doctors compared results. Families held their breath. Finally, April 12th, 1955. Exactly 10 years after the death of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a man whose own foundation had helped finance this fight, Dr. Thomas Francis Jr. walked onto the stage at the University of Michigan. The room fell silent. No one moved. No one spoke. Years of hope, years of fear, years of work, all leading to this one moment. Then the announcement. The vaccine worked. It was safe. It was effective. And for the first time, parents could finally believe their children might grow up without fearing polio. Relief swept across the nation. Church bells rang. Schools burst into applause. Factories stopped working as people gathered around radios. Newspapers printed special editions. For millions, it felt as though a war had finally come to an end. Overnight, Jonas Salk became one of the most famous men on Earth. Only a few days later, Jonas Salk sat down with legendary journalist Edward R. Murrow. The vaccine had changed the world. America celebrated. Parents finally believed their children were safe. Then, near the end of the interview, Murrow asked one simple question. Who owns the patent on this vaccine? Salk didn't hesitate, not for a second. The people, I would say. There is no patent. Could you patent the sun? The interview ended, but those words didn't. They spread across America, then across the world. Within only a few years, they had become part of history. But as time passed, another story began to grow. People claimed that Jonas Salk had rejected a fortune, often described as $7 billion. It's a remarkable story. The problem is that there's no reliable evidence it ever happened. No documents, no contracts, no credible records showing that Salk was offered anything close to that amount. The truth is more complicated. Before the vaccine was ever released, lawyers working with the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis had already examined whether the vaccine could even be patented. Their conclusion was far less dramatic. Much of the science was already public, which meant any patent would likely be weak, limited, and extremely difficult to defend. That doesn't make Salk's words any less powerful. He truly believed the vaccine should belong to everyone, not to a corporation, not to one scientist, to the people. But one thing is often forgotten. The vaccine was never the work of one man. Behind Salk stood thousands of researchers, doctors, nurses, laboratory workers, volunteers, and nearly 2 million children whose families placed their trust in science. For one brief moment, it seemed the nightmare was finally over. Then, only weeks later, everything changed. The celebration didn't last. Only weeks after the vaccine was declared safe, something unthinkable began to happen. Doctors started reporting new cases of polio, not among the unvaccinated, among children who had already received the vaccine. No one could believe it. How could this happen? The investigation moved quickly. Before long, the source was found. One manufacturer, Cutter Laboratories. Some batches had not been fully inactivated. The virus inside them wasn't dead. It was still alive. The consequences were devastating. Nearly 200,000 doses had already been distributed. Around 40,000 children developed mild polio infections. more than 200 were left paralyzed. 10 people lost their lives. The Qatar incident became one of the greatest pharmaceutical disasters in American history. The vaccination campaign stopped almost overnight. Public confidence collapsed. Parents who had celebrated only days before were terrified once again. For Jonas Salk, it was heartbreaking. The tragedy hadn't come from his idea. It hadn't come from the science. It came from manufacturing, from quality control, from mistakes made far away from his laboratory. But to the public, none of that mattered. One name was now connected to everything: Jonas Salk. Investigations followed. Factories changed. Safety rules became stricter. Government oversight expanded dramatically. The tragedy changed how vaccines would be produced for generations to come. Eventually, the vaccination campaign began again, this time under far stricter standards. And this time, it worked. It really worked. After the Qatar incident, vaccination continued, this time under stricter rules, and the results were impossible to ignore. Year after year, polio began to disappear. The numbers kept falling. Thousands became hundreds. Hundreds became dozens. By 1979, wild poliovirus had been eliminated from the United States. But the story didn't end there. A few years later, Dr. Albert Sabin introduced an oral vaccine. No needles, just a few drops. It made mass vaccination faster, simpler, and far easier to deliver around the world. Together, the vaccines changed human history. Today, wild poliovirus survives in only a handful of places on Earth. Millions of children are alive today because one disease lost its war against science. Jonas Salk never claimed that victory for himself. He knew it belonged to everyone who made it possible: researchers, doctors, nurses, laboratory technicians, volunteers, millions of families who donated to the March of Dimes, and nearly 2 million children whose parents chose hope over fear. One of those who witnessed that transformation was Paul Alexander, the little boy who entered an iron lung at 6 years old. He lived long enough to see a world where no child would ever face the same future. He died in 2024, one of the last living reminders of an era the world never wants to return to.